I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Molly.
It is truly an honor and a privilege to have you in studio with us. So Dr. Tatum is the former president of Spelman College. She is also, and I have a whole list here of all your accolades, so we'll try to introduce you as quickly as possible and then we'll jump right in.
Sure.
So she's the former president of Spelman College, and she's also the author of the national bestseller, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Recently released the 20th anniversary edition of this. And I also want to note that the American Psychological Association gave you their highest honor in 2014, commemorating a lifetime contribution to psychology, recognizing your path-breaking work in race relations and leadership in higher education. So that's a very notable achievement. But again, we would be here all day if we were just talking about all the work that you've done in communities and race relations. But we wanted to talk to you not only about your book, the 20th anniversary edition of this, but a little bit about what communities can do to improve race relations and opening up discussion. So once again, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
And you are doing some speaking engagements, not only tonight at Roger Williams University, but you will be at the Gordon School in East Providence tomorrow, Thursday, November 9th from 6:30 to 8:30. That discussion is open to the public. It's free. So if you are interested in speaking with Dr. Tatum, want to hear more from what we're talking about today, you can join in on that. So let's jump right in. You wrote this book 20 years ago, and you came to the point where you were like, let's update this. What went into that decision that you decided you wanted to give an update personally, and what has changed in the past 20 years?
Well, thanks for asking. And I wanted to say that, when I wrote the book in 1997, I was a faculty member teaching a course on the psychology of racism and doing workshops with teachers and parents around the country. And I found when I was doing those workshops, often someone would ask me, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And that question and other conversations about race really is how the book got its title. And when I wrote that book, I found that it was being used by lots of schools and universities around the country, often with teacher preparation courses or other things. But fast forward 20 years later, it seemed to me that there was enough new information about the things that I've been writing about that the book deserved an update. People who've been reading it deserved current information. And I really wanted to reflect on life as it's understood from the viewpoint of somebody born in the 21st century. Here we are, 2017. I'm writing about young people, teenagers often, and those students who are today's teenagers weren't alive when I was writing this book.
That's very true.
So it seemed like time for an update.
And I've listened to people, I don't want to say criticism because there isn't a lot of criticism, but people who have reviewed the book, and they've said that something notable about this is that it's not just for scholars, it's not a textbook, is that this is easily accessible for anyone who wants to dig into information and be educated. And
Absolutely.
I think that's really notable. Was that kind of your intention?
Absolutely.
When you went into writing this in an updated version?
Yes, in both versions. It was definitely my intention to write for a general audience. I wanted to write for the parents who come to my workshops. I wanted to write for the teachers who find it useful in the classroom. But I also wanted to write for really anyone in a leadership role who's trying to understand how to better connect across lines of difference in today's 21st century society. You asked me earlier what's different, and one of the things that's different in the last 20 years is the demographics of our society. I was born in the 1950s. In 1954, the U.S. population was 90% white. So that gives you a moment to pause. Yeah.
It sure does, doesn't it? Yeah.
60 years later, in 2014, it was the first year that the school-age population, pre-K through 12, was 50% children of color. So that tells us that our society is changing and has changed rapidly over the last few decades. And certainly in the last 20 years, one of the things we know is that rapid growth has really accelerated. We know that today the Latinx population is the largest population of color in the United States, followed by African Americans. The Asian American population, which is only about 6%, is nonetheless the fastest growing population, largely a result of immigration. And even the multiracial population, which was something like 4% in 1970, is 10% today. So we see that these changes are happening, and all of that influences how we engage with one another. One thing that hasn't changed, however, is that neighborhoods are still segregated and schools are still segregated. And so when we think about the fact that we've got all these new faces in our country, and yet we still are divided along lines, often racial and ethnic lines, sometimes religious lines, certainly socioeconomic lines, and that makes it harder for young people to learn how to engage with one another in productive ways.
So what can we do? I want to talk about that because we are looking at schools becoming even more segregated.
Absolutely.
As we move forward, communities segregated, and so there's certain factors with that. As we move forward, as we see our population change, and our communities becoming more segregated, our schools more segregated, how do we make changes to work towards more inclusivity and to be more productive? And who is that up to? Is it up to us as community members? Is it up to people that are making decisions, policymakers? Who is that up to? And how do we make it better, make differences?
Well, I think we all have a role to play. One of the points I try to make in my book, and I hope I make it very clearly, is that each of us has an opportunity to make change. If we live in a community that is racially mixed, but we find that people are not engaging with one another, each of us has a responsibility or an opportunity to say, I can do something about that. I can invite a diverse group of people into my home to have a conversation.
I love that, an opportunity, not to interrupt you, but I like that. I like the word choice there. We all have the opportunity to take advantage of that.
Absolutely. And when we think about how, one of the things I used to tell my students and I tell my readers is that we all have a sphere of influence. Everybody influences someone. Maybe it's your family members, maybe it's your friends, maybe it's the people you work with, maybe it's the worship community you're a part of, your civic organization. We all influence someone. And if these conversations are important to us, we can use our spheres of influence to start a conversation about how do we create more inclusive communities in our town, in our neighborhood. How do we make sure that young people in our schools are learning how to connect with students different from themselves. I particularly do a lot of speaking in colleges and universities. And I mention that because colleges, higher education, is often a site where young people are coming together into environments that are more diverse than where they grew up. Often, college is the first time they've been in a community as diverse as they will find in their lives. And so I think there's a real opportunity and responsibility for leaders in those higher ed institutions to create space, structures, opportunities to use that environment to bring students together so that they can develop the skills, because it is a skill, to learn how to connect with someone whose life experience is different from your own.
And I love the fact that being able to take advantage and to develop those skill sets. But in fact, what you talk about in your book and when you're going out to having these discussions is that we should all be having conversations before you get to those opportunities of higher education, because not everybody goes to college. And we should all be having these conversations, whether it's at home, whether it's in our community, like you mentioned, in places of worship. We should all be having conversations about race and racism and racial injustice. We should all be having these conversations just in general, right?
Yes.
And I find it interesting that, some people find it uncomfortable. And
many people find it uncomfortable,
And we should, and is it your opinion that we should get to a point where it just should be a part of everyday conversation? How do we approach this?
Well, let me start by talking a little bit about the discomfort. Okay. Certainly, one of the things that I can tell you is a universal experience. When I speak to audiences across the country, I will often ask people to raise their hands if they have an early race-related memory, something that happened in childhood. almost everyone will raise their hand. And if you ask, how old were they when this thing happened, without even asking them to tell it, just how old were you when that incident you're recalling happened? Most people will say 4, 5, 6, early, preschool, early elementary ages. And then I ask, what feeling, what emotion is associated with that experience? And for many people, it might be, a feeling of affection or love or even curiosity. We might think of those as relatively positive. But for most people, the feelings are more like anger or embarrassment or shame or fear or confusion. And
It's heartbreaking.
it is.
Heartbreaking.
And yet it's very common. And then if you ask that same audience, how many of you talked to a caring adult, a parent or a teacher at the time that it happened? Most people will say they didn't. Now, if you know anything about 4, 5, or 6-year-olds, they're pretty candid.
Yeah, it's so true, yes.
They don't filter much. But why is it then that so many adults, so many grown-ups will say, I remember something that happened in my childhood. It upset me. I didn't talk to anyone about it. That's odd. And so when you ask, well, why didn't you? Often they'll say, I don't know, I didn't have the words, or I wasn't sure what to say, or maybe I had done something wrong. I mean, there was so much confusion. But however it's conveyed, it becomes pretty clear that they learned very early that they weren't supposed to talk about this. And if you think about the fact that, now in our adulthood, we have not just that one experience, but maybe lots of experiences.
Built up, yeah.
Where we have been given the message, you're not supposed to talk about this. So when you ask people to do something that they have deep recollection of not talking about, you're asking them to kind of break a taboo, and it's hard to do that. It does generate discomfort. But as I say in the book, and as I say when I'm speaking to people, we can't solve a problem if we can't talk about it.
That's so very true.
Yeah.
So what can we all do to change? What are a couple, besides read your book, what are some simple changes that we can do, whether we have children, whether we can what are some simple things that we can do? I think we're at such a divisive point right now that we all need to take, 1 or 2 steps.
Absolutely.
To just open ourselves up and begin conversations, whether it's at home, whether it's in our community, places of worship, at work. I'm not sure, but I think something needs to change so we can all make a positive change, right?
Well, one of the things you said, besides reading my book, I want to underscore, and I mean, certainly I think people should read my book. I hope they will find it helpful. But one of the places that people can have conversation is around a book club. And I mentioned that.
Yeah.
I mentioned that because that's a structure that a lot of people are familiar with. Whether you live in an apartment building and there's a book club in your building or in your school or in your worship community, a lot of people are part of conversation groups where they're having a shared experience, like reading a book together, and then talking about it. That's one way to get started. It's an easy way because it's a way that many people are familiar with. But it's also possible, certainly, to just listen for those opportunities, particularly at home. When I speak at the Gordon School tomorrow, I will be talking about how parents can have these conversations with children. And one of the things we know is that children do notice difference. Often people will say, oh, my daughter or my son is colorblind. Usually what that means to me is that they've learned to be color silent, that they don't mention it, but they do notice difference. And particularly young children, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, will comment on the differences they see. And helping a child to learn that the differences they notice are not differences that mean someone's better or worse, but simply that we live in a world just like there are different kinds of flowers and trees and there are different kinds of people. And helping kids have that understanding can be a very simple thing. There's an example in my book of conversations that I've had with my own children, but I'm going to lift up this one. I was cooking on a Saturday morning with my son, who at the time, I have 2 sons, and this one was about 4 years old. And there was one egg left in the carton. It was a white egg. And there was another carton of eggs. This time they were brown eggs. So I had this one white egg and a brown egg out on the counter. He observed that they were different. And I said, they are, but look at this. They're just like people. I cracked the eggs open. They were both the same inside. Just like people, they look different on the outside, but we're all the same on the inside. Didn't have to be a big lecture, but it was at a time when he was asking a lot of questions about physical difference. And those conversations can be quite natural if parents feel comfortable in having them.
I think that's such a beautiful example, and like you mentioned, so simple and can be so natural if you start having them. Right?
Yes.
It's so beautiful, and just taking a couple easy minutes out of your day.
Mm-hmm.
I want to take a different turn on that. A lot of times, depending on your generation, kids are learning maybe not so simple discussions
Yes.
from their parents, or maybe not the best habits
Mm-hmm.
from people at home.
Yes.
In what can we do from that?
Well, sometimes I have this conversation with teachers, or school leaders who are trying to create an inclusive environment, trying to create an environment where all the students feel welcome, trying to create an environment where everyone is being treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly.
And sometimes you'll have children or parents using language that suggests they're not learning to treat people with dignity and respect. And that can be a conflict. We've got certain values at our school, kids are learning something else at home. How do we address that? And one of the things I tell teachers and school leaders is that it becomes very important to be clear about what the values are of your school community. And children, whether they're young or teenagers or college age, do come to understand that there can be one set of conversations that's happening at home and another standard of behavior, school language versus home language, and young people can learn to make the difference and ultimately choose for themselves. When I have had the privilege of teaching students who will sometimes say, I grew up with certain attitudes, but I have come to understand that these attitudes are rooted in misunderstanding or stereotypes or ignorance. I don't necessarily want to act on those attitudes. When you're an adult, you can make those choices. But it is important, I think, particularly in school environments, to create an environment where everyone feels as though they're included.
I think that's a really powerful statement, because oftentimes you can be a product of your environment, and it's difficult. So if you are in a school environment, a school setting, just having those positive examples and feeling warm and welcome, because sometimes children will act out and they don't necessarily know. So having a positive example, and so that's up to leaders and administrators. So being able to set a good example, I think, is really powerful. I kind of want to switch gears here. We've been talking about children and parents and families, a little bit about community. I had a question for you, just kind of because, I do want to get your input, because you are such an expert in this. I want to talk to you a little bit about, there's been a lot going on lately. A lot has been brought up, social injustice and racial inequality. Things have been happening forever, right? I mean, this is not a new topic, but there has been a pretty powerful movement over the past few years, and a lot more things have been brought to the forefront, whether it is through the Black Lives Matter movement or the recent NFL protests. I kind of wanted to get your opinion on these recent movements and how you think that has brought a new dialogue to the conversation.
Well, one of the things that I think is really important, and maybe I will start in this way, if we think about someone who was born in 1997, the year I wrote my book, I want to start there, because I think that how we think about the kinds of questions you just asked in some ways depends on what generation we are.
Oh,
right?
Course, yeah.
So if you were born in 1997, you were 4 years old when 9/11 happened. And you might not remember 9/11, but your growing up years have certainly been shaped by the post-9/11 climate. Fast forward, let's say now you're 11. That's 2008. Two important things happened in 2008. One was the collapse of the economy and the economic anxiety that that stimulated for lots of families. But also, a few months later, the election of President Obama. And so now, 2008, we have the election, first African American president, and many people, even if they didn't vote for him, said in a USA Today poll right after the election that they felt encouraged by the fact that the nation had been able to cross this very symbolic barrier. However, after his election, and maybe because of that, after his election, there was a lot of conversation about being in a post-racial society, right? That race was not as much of a barrier today or then in 2008 as it was years before. And so if you're 11 when that happened, you're growing up at a time when you're hearing this post-racial language, right? And most of your adolescence, you've been watching television, seeing President Obama representing the United States and having that visual image of a black president and the symbolic significance of that. But fast forward 4 years later, 2012, you're 15 years old, and one of the big things that has happened that certainly has made an impression on your adolescence is the murder of Trayvon Martin. Yeah. And really Black Lives Matter started to pick up just at that time in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman after that shooting. And so depending on...
It's been a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot for young people to deal with. It's a lot for people of my generation to deal with, let alone young people seeing this.
And so you're 15 when that happens. Fast forward 2 years later, you're 17. 2014 is the year. In 2014 is the death of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. One of several, as we know, police shootings in that year, or police fatalities.
And these are the ones that are just getting media publicity,
Exactly.
right? These are of countless,
right?
You know,
right.
these are
the
just
ones
the ones
we
making
see on
big
the news,
headlines.
the ones captured on cell video.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but it's very difficult to reconcile those fatal police shootings of unarmed black men and to some extent women, because there's women who are also been victimized in that way, to put that together with this post-racial narrative you've been hearing since you were 11. So it's a confusing set of circumstances. And then fast forward to 2016, you're 19 years old now. President Trump has been elected in November 2016. And following his election, the rise and visibility of neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and of course this summer, the Charlottesville incident. So you can see that there's been a lot of difficult stuff to process. And if you say to me, someone born in 1954, has there been progress in our society? I would say yes, because I can compare my life circumstance to that of my parents. You know, my parents were born in 1926. They grew up in the Jim Crow era. You know, their lives were very much shaped by that. That was different from my growing up experience. But if you were born in 1997 and someone asked you, is our society getting better? It's going to be a hard question to say yes to, given all the things I've just laid out. So I think that part of our challenge when we talk about what's happening in our society is the fact that we don't often put what's happening right now in a historical context, that we don't always look at it in terms of, you know, it's not just a problem today, but it has been a problem for a long time and people are frustrated. Sometimes we don't recognize the ways in which racism has so been embedded in the policies and practices of our nation that things that we might not recognize as examples of racism are in fact very much so if we knew the history and how they got there. Even neighborhoods, you know, when we talk about neighborhood segregation, it's not just random acts of renting that led to the segregation we see. It's been policies about how real estate practices have steered people to certain neighborhoods. It's related to lending practices and what we refer to as redlining in terms of being willing to loan in areas that are seen as largely white and stable versus areas that are black and brown and seen as less desirable. All of these things are part of our growing up experience and today's reality, but we don't always know that when we're looking at the end result.
And we could take a look at the historical context in many different ways, and diving into those individual issues, I think, makes it very interesting the way we could look at it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you another question sort of related to that. How can the media do better, in your opinion, and how does the media play a part in all this, and how do you think the media can do better?
Well, I think that when we have time, as we do here today, to have a more extended conversation, that helps. I think so often our news comes to us in little sound bites. And so the opportunity to put it in a historical context, or the opportunity to even bring in multiple voices, and I'm not talking about, the 6 heads talking at once, which I think is not particularly helpful. But I think, when we have as we say, the long interview, when we have the opportunity to really provide background information to help people deepen their understanding of something, that makes a difference. You're talking about media broadly defined, and I wanted to mention social media, not just, the professionals who are doing interviews, but those of us who are on social media sending out messages in 140 characters or less. I think that makes it also more difficult to have meaningful dialogue. Because while I am an avid user of Twitter and I find it useful, I also know that if you want to have really meaningful dialogue, it's much better to do it face-to-face, and it might take more than 140 characters to say what you think.
That's very true. Messages can be misconstrued depending on how and when, so it's always face-to-face conversation is always the best.
Absolutely.
We do need to wrap up here shortly as we get ready for the taste, but just going off of that point, when we're having conversations like these and we're putting out conversations like these, because I think education is vital.
Absolutely.
I think it's so important to have these conversations, and that's why I was so excited to be able to talk with you today. And so I think it's so crucial that we, as the media, be able to provide this kind of information so people can get educated and then become interested. But how do we get people interested in learning about these things? How do we get people to read your book, or to go to community discussions, or how do we get people willing to talk to their neighbor that maybe look or sound different than them or have a different background?
Yes. Yeah.
How do we get people interested so that we can get things to change and get things better?
I want to tell you an example of this. So I was speaking at a college not long ago, and I had a very diverse group of students who came to my talk, and afterwards I was signing books. And there was a young white man who came to get his book signed. And he said to me, I tried to get some of my friends, also young white men, I tried to get some of my friends to come to the talk. And, they didn't want to come. They said, I know what she's going to say.
Oh.
And he said, and I kind of felt that way too. And so then I asked him, I said, well, did I say what you thought I was going to say? And he said, well, no, actually you didn't. And so then he said I found it really interesting, and I learned some things I didn't expect to learn. And so then I said, well, then what you now need to do is go to your friends and say, I thought what you thought, but then I found out that it wasn't exactly what I expected. And now I feel like the next time a speaker comes, or the next time I have this opportunity, I really want to take advantage of it, and I want you to come with me. And I think that language, I felt that way, but I found this out. I was nervous about these conversations, but then I found out that it really can actually make a difference in how you feel about something. And now I feel like it's really important for me to do more of this, and I hope you'll come with me the next time I go, or the next time, or help me host it. That there are ways to invite people into the dialogue that I think can really make a difference.
I love that, and I think that's an excellent opportunity to say to people, hey, I felt that way too, and now I'm making a change.
Yes.
Do you think that kind of brings me to my next question is there ever a time where we are too old to begin the dialogue about race?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, we all have heard the the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm not sure that's true, but I certainly can say that I have had the privilege of talking to people of all ages, from young children to senior citizens, and I think it's never too late for us to learn something new and to change how we're interacting with other people.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it's so important now that we all just get to know our neighbors a little bit better.
Yeah.
And try to experience and teach each other a little kindness. I don't think that can hurt anyone, right?
Not in the least, not in the least. And, when we think about interrupting systems of oppression, whether it's racism or sexism or classism, one of the things that I have learned over the years is that what motivates people to take action is often because they care about somebody else. They're speaking up because they care about their children. They're speaking up because they care about a loved one. They're speaking up because it has become personal to them. And I think that as we expand our social networks, as we expand our friendships, we not only model that for our children. People who have a multiracial group of friends are going to have children with a multiracial group of friends. Not only do we model that for our children, but I think we create the platform from which we all can take action that we feel good about.
I love that. As we wrap up here, just what's kind of one closing message that you'd like people to take home with today, whether they're scrolling through this on their Facebook feed or their Twitter feed, or they're heading out to the bookstore and maybe having the opportunity to pick up a book for their children. What's one closing message that you'd like everyone to take home today?
We all have a sphere of influence. Everybody influences someone, and we should not be afraid to use that influence to bring about the changes we hope to see.
I love that. So use your sphere of influence for something hopefully positive. Dr. Beverly Tatum, thank you so much for joining me today. If you would like the opportunity to speak with her, she'll be at the Gordon School in East Providence Thursday, November 9th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. She'll be talking about her 20th anniversary edition of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and other conversations about race. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, thank you so much for joining me today here on Go Local Live. I really appreciate your time, and I know you have to get going. So thank you once again. It's been so enlightening and a privilege. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day.